I am going to talk about Collingwood's contribution to the philosophy of history. And I have realized while being here that Collingwood, I mean, not that I didn't know it before, but it has become very, very evident that Collingwood is read in many different ways. So what I will be doing here is not so much defend an exegetical claim about how Collingwood should be read. I have done somewhere else, and there is no way in which I can do that. So what I do instead is to present a reading of Collingwood that may or may not coincide with the way in which you are used to reading it, and then see how it could be used to make an intervention in some issues which are debated now in the philosophy of history. And that is usually the way in which I have approached his work, as trying to locate it in contemporary debates in the philosophy of action or in contemporary debates, for example, in metaphilosophy. What I want to do today is to try to see how he fits in the philosophy of history. So the title of the paper, I should say, is Beyond Scientism and Historicism, Collingwood and the Role of the Philosophy of History. I will not speak directly to the question of the role of the philosophy of history, but what it takes to be the role of the philosophy of history will emerge indirectly by looking at his contribution. So as I say, I want to look at how he would intervene in some debates, and in particular in two debates, how he would intervene because he's not here and he didn't witness, for example, the narrativist turn. The two debates I want to look at are, first of all, the question of the conflictual relationship between science and the history of the philosophy of science, and secondly, the question of whether there can be objective knowledge of the past. So those are the two questions that I want to consider. How is it that if Collingwood were to make a contribution today, what is it that he would say? But why should I consider Collingwood in the first place? Well, this is the problem. There is a familiar mantra which goes more or less like this. Science is objective, whereas history is subjective. So whenever you compare science and history, normally history comes out worse off. It's not the only subject. The same goes for philosophy. Whenever philosophy is compared with science, people say, well, look, science has made a lot of progress. Philosophers are still there, disagreeing with one another and discussing the same things as Plato. Now, what are the reasons that are given for history not being objective? There are lots of reasons. There is the personal bias of the historian in selecting the data. There is the intersubjective bias of the historian zeitgeist. It is sometimes said that historical narratives cannot be compared to the past as it is in itself because there are no truth makers for past events, either because Julius Caesar no longer exists, for example, or because colligatory concepts are not the kind of things which have truth makers. Or it is sometimes said that because the standpoint of the present from which historians write their narratives is ever shifting, there can never be something like a definitive account of the past. Historians will have to rewrite history from the point in time in which they are. Now, the reason for revisiting Collingwood is because I think that he offers a way of thinking about the relationship between history and science in which history does not come out worse off in the comparison. His perspective to this is that, first of all, scientific knowledge should not be taken as the measure of overall knowledge, and that history is a distinctive kind of knowing with its own presuppositions, its own method, and its own subject matter. So it is an autonomous form of inquiry. So that the distinction between history and science should be considered to be a distinction in kind. History should not be considered as a kind of, if you like, halfway house between science and fiction, on a kind of sliding scale where history is marginally better than fiction but not as good as science. So if you take science as providing the standards, then of course history is not gonna meet those standards. Now, in order to see how Collingwood would contribute to this debate, one has to get, I think, his metaphilosophy right. And as I said, or at least he has to read him in a particular way. And as I said, I'm not going to defend how I read his metaphilosophy, but on the other hand, I'm going to present to you how I read it. Now, the way I read it is that he is not defending the view that all knowledge is historical knowledge, but he is defending the view that all knowledge is governed by presuppositions. And those two claims are very different. So it is one thing to say that there is no such thing as presuppositionless knowledge, and it is another thing to say that there is no such thing as a historical knowledge. In some sense, if you're saying that there is no such thing as a historical knowledge, you are denying the autonomy of science. But you're not doing that if you are saying that all knowledge has presuppositions. All that you're saying is that history and science have different kinds of presuppositions. So I take it, his metaphysics of absolute presuppositions, to be defending not a form of historical relativism, which claims that presuppositions are relative to time and place, but a form of explanatory pluralism, which claims that all knowledge depends on presuppositions. And I see in some ways this kind of explanatory pluralism to be anticipating or to be closer to Van Frassen's pragmatics of explanation, to the view that all explanations are answers to why questions. There are because answers to why questions, and that there are different types of why questions that fit different explanatory goals. Okay, so that is in the background of the interpretation, but and I can see that some people may not read Collingwood in that way. He has made some claims in an essay on metaphysics that can be read, where his metaphysics can be read in more historical relativist ways. But I think that, as with all philosophers, he also says other things, and if there are ambiguities in what he does, then you have to make hermeneutic choices. And I have made that hermeneutic choices. And this is in Collingwood, but I can see that not everything that he says can be square with it. Okay, what is the conflict between science and the history of the philosophy of science? Well, natural science claims that there are timeless truths about nature that can be discovered by scientific investigation. Whereas the history of the philosophy of science shows that what scientists in different periods of history have uncovered are not timeless truths about nature, but historically relative conceptions of nature. So there is the Ptolemaic conception of nature and the Copernican conception of nature. And there is a conflict here because it cannot be both the case that there are timeless truths about nature, which science uncovers, and that there are no such things as timeless truths about nature as the history of the philosophy of science seems to show us. Now, what is Collingwood's solution? His solution to this question is an instance of his more general approach to the question of what is the relationship between science and history. And he thinks that the the conflict between science and history is not ontologically deep. He is not a constructive metaphysician. So he claims that metaphysics is a science of absolute presuppositions, that it is a logical inquiry, that it is a metaphysics without ontology. So he thinks the conflict is not ontologically deep, that it is a conflict concerning the presuppositions that govern different forms of inquiry, and that when we provide kinds of explanations, we switch from one set of presuppositions to the next. At a very basic level, what are these presuppositions? Well, science presupposes that nature is uniform. So for the scientist, water will freeze at 0 Celsius in the 3rd millennium AD, as it did in Victorian times. And this is because the presuppositions of the uniformity of nature, it's something that serves the goal of prediction as indeed of retrodiction. It doesn't really matter whether one is concerned with the Big Bang, which happened before, or something that will happen in the future. And that is a presupposition that Collingwood thinks govern the empirical investigation of nature. On the other hand, he thinks that history, understood in a way to be qualified as the study of human nature, to be heavily qualified, as to presuppose that human beings are responsive to norms. So the way in which historians approach the behavior of past human beings is by thinking that they don't approach them by studying them like solar eclipses, by using the nomological method, Hempel, etc., but by assuming that they are responsive to epistemic norms, to aesthetic norms, to moral norms that might be different from those that the interpreter has. So that the historian, in this sense for Collingwood, has to presuppose something quite different. A, that human beings are responsive to norms, and B, that these norms change from time to place, that they may not be the same as those of the interpreter. This means that the kind of because that is used in historical and scientific explanation for Collingwood is a different kind of because. So is Avicii here? Yes? He is, yeah, okay. So I'm going to try to explain the difference between a historical explanation or an explanation that uses a particular form of inference that Collingwood thinks is characteristic of history, or is necessary at least in history, and one which, on the other hand, is used in science. So there are two ways in which I could explain why Avicii has come to my paper. I could say that is what academics routinely do. So when they go to conferences, they just go to the other invited speakers' papers. And that's something that you could know by means of observation, in the same way in which you observe natural phenomenon. Or I could say, on the other hand, that Avicii is here because he is responding to a norm. He ought, in some sense, to come. He is expected to come. And in that sense, I make a kind of, not a nomological prediction or retrodiction, but rather a rational prediction or retrodiction, about how Avicii will behave. And that's, for Collingwood, what historians do when they treat human beings as responding to norms. So Collingwood thinks that the explanation of action, and action for him is a technical term, is not just what human beings do, but it's what human beings do insofar as they respond to norms, regarding agents not as following empirical patterns, but as being responsive to reasons. So explanations are becausal answers to why questions, and we have different kind of why questions. So when I ask why Avicii came, I can mean different things by that, and depending on what is the why, I've got to match the right kind of because. And this means that there is a distinction between, for Collingwood, the historical and the natural past. because they are understood in different ways. So historians do not retrodict the actions of past agents in the way in which an astronomer retrodicts the occurrence of a solar eclipse. Understanding agents from past cultures is more like understanding a language or a form of life. So historians for Collingwood do not study the past per se, yeah, but they study the past under a different set of presuppositions, such as agents are responsive to norms, these norms change from space, from time to time. So here is a quote. He says, types of behavior do no doubt recur so long as minds of the same kind are placed in the same kinds of situations. The behavior patterns characteristic of a feudal baron were no doubt fairly constant so long as there were feudal barons living in a feudal society, but it will be sought in vain except by an inquirer content with the loosest and most fanciful analogies in a world whose social structure is of another kind. A positive science of mind will no doubt be able to establish uniformities and recurrences, but it can have no guarantee that the laws it establishes will hold good beyond the historical period from which effects are drawn. So we can find empirical regularities, really, but these empirical regularities themselves rely on certain form of rationalizations, and these rationalizations will be historically specific. So the distinction here I want to emphasize again is a distinction between a form of inference. It's not a distinction between explaining human beings and natural events. Because I often explain what my daughter does nomologically. I tell her, to my partner, how could she bang the door because her hormones are playing up. You know, so I explain her behavior nomologically. Sometimes she does it herself when she says, Mama, don't be so sensitive. You know, I'm a teenager. I'm expected to be like that. So we can explain human beings empirically or nomologically. The distinction for Collingwood is the distinction between the form of inference. It's not a distinction. It's the form of inference that determines whether what you are explaining is historical subject matter or not. Now, these absolute presuppositions which govern forms of inquiry for Collingwood are not true or false. And what he means by that is that to predicate truth or falsity to them makes no sense. And this is because we cannot compare the presuppositions that govern a form of inquiry with an inquiry-independent reality. They set the parameters for providing certain forms of explanation that will generate correct and incorrect answers. But in themselves, they cannot be compared with an inquiry-independent reality. So in this respect, Collingwood is not a local but a global anti-representationalist. So he thinks that you cannot compare the presuppositions that govern history to a history-independent reality, but so you cannot compare the presuppositions that govern natural science to a science-independent reality. And that means that when you choose between explanatory frameworks, you cannot do it on metaphysical grounds, yeah, which one of them gets it right, is true of an inquiry-independent reality, but you do it on pragmatic grounds, meaning which kind of explanation is really satisfying your curiosity or is answering the question that you are asking. And here is an illustration of the kind of pragmatism which, and I can see that I have also become very aware that there are different kinds of pragmatism. But here is an illustration of a pragmatic moment in Collingwood, when he gives the example of a person who stands by the side of the road because the car has stopped working, and he wants to know why. And the first person who comes by is a physicist who says, oh, I know, sir, why your car isn't working. It's because the center of the earth is further removed from the top of the hill than the bottom of the hill. Then the second person who comes along is an AA person, and the AA man says, oh, I know why, sorry, that you've got a loose cable. Now, the second person is employing a manipulability account of causation of the kind that Collingwood thinks is at work not in the theoretical sciences of nature, such as physics and engineering, but such as physics, but in the practical sciences of nature, such as engineering, for example. And he says, well, that's the kind of explanation that I needed in this context. That is what satisfies, if you like, my curiosity here. So Collingwood develops a form of explanatory pluralism rather than historical relativism. And this means that he, if you like, he undermines the fact-value distinction more in the manner of Van Frassen than Kuhn. I'll say a little bit more about this. So if you are an explanatory pluralist, as I think Collingwood is, then this does not give rise to certain paradoxes that arise when one historicizes the claims of science. So Kuhn at some point said that the reference of scientific terms cannot be fixed independently of the context of the theory in which they were developed. And consequently, there is no meaning equivalence across scientific paradigms. And Latour has taken this, I'm here kind of following in part a paper by Uni, has taken this insight into an uncompromising historicist direction and has claimed that look, since the Koch bacilli, the tubercle bacillus, was discovered in 1882, the Koch bacilli cannot be invoked to explain why Ramses II died, because since the reference to scientific terms is theory dependent, and the theory in which they were embedded dates to 1882, it is not possible to determine tuberculosis as the causes of Ramses II's death, since he lived in the 13th century BC. And so if you historicize science, then you get this conclusion that since bacteriology was not around in the 13th century BC, at the time of Ramses II, and the tubercle bacillus is part and parcel of a theoretical framework that was not available to the Egyptians, then imputing Ramses' death to the Koch bacillus is a kind of anachronism which is analogous to, to one that one would make if one was trying to understand the actions of the Azande in the light of 20th century medical knowledge. But if you, on the other hand, read Collingwood's metaphilosophy in a different way, as arguing in support of a form of explanatory pluralism where forms of inquiry are governed by different absolute presuppositions, that such paradox does not arise, because from the perspective or presuppositions of natural science, nature is uniform. So nature is uniform is not a metaphysical claim about reality, it's a presupposition of natural science. And there is no paradox in determining the cause of Ramses II's death with your scientist hat on and say that it was the tubercle bacillus. So the possible coexistence of history and natural science for Collingwood is defended not by reducing all knowledge, including scientific knowledge, to historical knowledge, which would be a kind of topsy-turvy form of historicism, of scientism, but by showing that the methodological practices that work in different forms of inquiry are governed by different presuppositions that they provide answers to different questions. So there is no problem in making that claim, provided that you're saying, I've switched my hat, I'm now speaking as a scientist, I'm not speaking as a historian or as a cultural anthropologist. As a historian, I cannot understand the way in which the Egyptians believed by ascribing to them the way in which the Egyptians acting by ascribing them the belief in the tubercle bacillus. But as a scientist, I have no problem in explaining his death in that way. Okay. So this is one way in which, if you take his metaphysics, he could make a contribution to that debate about how to handle the conflictual relationship between science and the history of the philosophy of science. Okay, here is the second question to which I think he could make a contribution. The question, is objective historical knowledge possible? Now, before answering that question, I want to disambiguate it a little, because I think it can be understood in different ways. One way in which it can be understood is as asking, is it possible to view reality as past historical agents did, without imposing on them the mindset of the historian or the interpreter? So, and this question is a question about how we understand agents who have different beliefs than those of the interpreter. The other question, on the other hand, or the question could also be interpreted in a different ways as asking, is it possible to provide objective accounts of events which are not directly observed but are, on the other hand, reconstructed on the basis of the evidence? So there is not one question here about the past. There's at least two. There probably are more if one disambiguated the question. Now, generally, I think that Collingwood's answers to both this question is yes, we can. Yeah? So yes, we can understand historical agents as they understood themselves, and yes, we can provide objective accounts of past events. But clearly, this doesn't mean yes, we do. Yeah? It doesn't mean that it's always done. I think what he believes in is the in principle possibility of doing this. With respect to the first question, can we understand past agents with a different mindset from that of the historian? As I said, Collingwood's answer is yes. And for him, this question is no different from understanding other cultures that are contemporaneous to the historian. So in this respect, I'd say that Collingwood's answer is a loggerheads with, for example, with Gadamer, who has very famously claimed that in order to be understood, the past has to be understood in a different way each time, or even with Quine's claim concerning the indeterminacy of translation. So you want to say we can see the world as the Greeks did. And in terms of the second question, how can we provide objective accounts of the past? He tries to answer that question affirmatively by comparing the historian to the detective. So what I want to do is to say a little bit more about these two questions. So the first concern with objectivity has to do with whether we can understand agents as they understood themselves. Now, first of all, Collingwood doesn't think that in order to understand agents as they understood themselves is the same as understanding the past as it is in itself. Rather, it is to understand the past through a different form of cultural mediation. So understanding other agents as they understood themselves does not require believing that what they believe is true, is to take on, is to entertain their thought, the intentional context of thought, as Jonas was speaking about the other day. And it's really no different from, well, there are some differences, but it's not in principle different from, understanding, for example, agents that have different beliefs. When we put, when children believe that if they put a tooth under the pillow, the tooth fairy will come and leave them some money, yeah? Now, we understand them not because we believe in the existence of the tooth fairy, but because we entertain their belief for the sake of understanding. So, for Collingwood, unless one is willing to deny that it is possible to understand other contemporaneous cultures and agents in their own terms, there is really no reason to hold, as Gadamer did, that each new generation of historians has to understand the past in a different way, so that we cannot understand the Greeks as they understood themselves. Now, clearly, there will be epistemic obstacles in the way. It depends on how much knowledge we have of a past culture. So there are more epistemic obstacles in the way with the past than with the present, because the cultural anthropologist cannot travel in time, whereas it can travel in space. But in principle, the problem is the same, and it is possible to entertain another person's thought. As you can see, I've stayed very, very clear of terms like reenactment, empathy, and so on. I've just done it that way, without using any of Collingwood's terminology. Now, I think that what Collingwood would say is that perhaps what has led some, I don't know whether he would say that, but maybe why some people have denied that it's possible to do this is because there's a kind of fear of making a realist commitment. Of saying that if you can know the past as, if you can know the Greeks as they saw themselves, that somehow you're committing yourself to some form of realism. But I think that would deny, because it is one thing to claim that the past can be known in itself, and it is an altogether different thing to say that we can know it through a different form of cultural mediation. And that's what Collingwood is saying, that it's possible to know the past through a different form of cultural motivation. So if the motivation for denying that past agents can be understood in the same way by different generation of historians is that this claim entails a commitment to some kind of realism, and one doesn't want to make a commitment to realism, then that fear is misplaced. Of course, some people will want to make a commitment to realism. Okay, I now want to say a little bit about the second way in which the question, can the past be objectively known, be interpreted, and what is it that Collingwood has to say about it? Now, I think the question arises against the background assumption that the past cannot be known in itself. So it's a background assumption. So the assumption is that there is no non-inferential representational knowledge of the past, that the past is known inferentially on the basis of the evidence available. And the worry is that the evidence that we have for what happened undetermines the narrative or the account, since the data could be arranged in different ways. So here the concern is not whether we can understand past agents as they understood themselves, but whether we can have objective accounts of the course of events on the basis of the data available. Now, Collingwood's answer to this was to compare the historian to a detective. And he did that because he wanted to say that the kind of conclusions that historians reach are not permissive, which is to say they're not like the probabilistic conclusions of inductive argument. They compel you. They have to compel you. Sometimes he went even overboard and said that they compel you like a mathematical argument. But this is, one of his uncharacteristically unguarded statements that get him into trouble, as many, like the actions as an insider, and an outside, all those things that have got him into a lot of trouble. But But I don't think that one should take him as meaning that historical inference is deductive as the kind of inferences that you get in the exact sciences. It's just a way of overemphasizing the point that the conclusion of historical inference is not like the probabilistic inference, the probabilistic conclusion of inductive argument. And I think that what he has in mind is something like, you know, when you watch these crime dramas, I probably watch too many of them, and there are lots of very good scandal drama on. So, you know, you see the detective, he pieces the evidence together, then he presents the evidence to what he takes to be the guilty party, and they crumble. You know, they have to accept the evidence. So I think this is what Collingwood has in mind. Now, I am not sure what name to give to this kind of inference, but for him, it is the kind of inference that you get in history. So he thinks that this inference is compelling. So to this extent, I think that he would really welcome, maybe he has even anticipated Uni's post-narrativist term, in the sense that he thinks that historical, the conclusions that historians present us with, the views that they present us with, is something that they have to persuade us of. So I think he would be very sympathetic to the suggestion that the historian is a critical reasoner, and that what the historian gives us are arguments in support of a conclusion. There are some slight differences that I suppose I want to point them out very, very, very gently, because although there are differences, I think, you know, there's so much agreement as well. One has to strike the right balance. So I take it that what post-narrativism wants to say is that there's goodness in the narrativist turn, and the goodness has to do with the constructivism. So the narrativist insight is that what historians do is something that they construct out of data, but there are some perceived skeptical implications from this, i.e. that because historians colligate in different ways, or because, you know, the data can be arranged in different ways, there is far too much indeterminacy, to put it mildly. And what Uni argued is that, well, these constructions are not arbitrary because they follow certain criteria, for example, comprehensiveness, exemplification, and so on and so on and so forth. I think that the post-narrativist also, I think this is what you want to say, Uni, you may correct me if I'm wrong, is that want to say at one level that what really matters in history is justification, not truth, but the constructions which the historian is making are constructions out of some raw material that are in fact representational truths. So the conclusion of historical arguments are inferential, but the building blocks are not. The building blocks are non-inferential truths. And I think that probably Collingwood would deny, because he is an anti-representationalist. So I'll try to illustrate this point by kind of using his detective analogy. So let's think that the historian is a little bit like a detective. He will work with data. So he goes to the forensic pathologist, and the forensic pathologist says, look, I found this grit under the victim's fingernail, and it shows that the sand comes from the bay in Oulu. Therefore, that's, you know, the body has been transported in the warehouse from the bay, or whatever, yeah? Now, what Collingwood would say, that is true, it's not a historical fact, because in order for that to count, for something to count as an historical fact, it has to be, it has to enter, if you like, into the detective story about what happened. But it doesn't mean, on the other hand, that it is a representational or non-inferential truth. It's an inferential truth which it is arrived at on the basis of the kind of inferences that pathologists make. So it's some sort of inductive fact, but it is not a non-inferential fact. So Collingwood is a global anti-representationalist because he would say, yes, that's right, what matters in history is justification, yeah? But history is not in a particularly different position from other disciplines because in history you can have justification, but you cannot have truth because there are no truth makers. So his view is that all claims to, if you like, truth or falsity are internal to forms of inquiry and are made possible by certain presuppositions that govern that form of inquiry. Scientific facts, as much as historical facts, are known inferential, and there are no non-inferential representational facts. I don't know whether I've done a good job of explaining this, but I guess we can come. So once you accept that all forms of inquiries are based by presuppositions, yeah, that those presuppositions determine the method that is being used, and the method serves certain explanatory purposes, and that is true for all forms, that applies to all forms of inquiry, then history no longer finds itself in a position that is fundamentally different from other forms of inquiry. So what Collingwood is rejecting here, if you like, is the traditional layered view of the sciences, according to which you get a fundamental layer of justification, a fundamental layer where the explanations are ontologically basic. So they're both the ways of explaining, and they capture real ontological relations which hold amongst things. What Collingwood wants to say, on the other hand, is that historical facts are the correlative of historical explanations, scientific facts are the correlative of scientific explanation, and so science and history in that respect are in a similar position. Now for Collingwood this means that really there cannot be any such thing as a metaphysical challenge to the possibility of historical knowledge. Now there was a recent article by Bolter in the Journal of the Philosophy of History where he said, look, you know, a lot of people are concerned with the epistemic challenge to historical knowledge, with the fact that, you know, the evidence underdetermines the arguments or conclusions of historians. But there is an even more fundamental challenge, and the more fundamental challenge is that no matter how justified the arguments or narratives that the historians will come up with, they can never be true in principle, and they can never be true in principle because there are no such thing as historical truth makers. So Bolter says something like this. He says, what is the standard definition of knowledge? The standard definition of knowledge is that it is justified through belief, okay? But historians cannot have, in principle, any true beliefs because there are no truth makers. So this is even, you know, this is an even more damaging, potentially more damaging objection to the possibility of historical knowledge. Now, if Collingwood is right, and if one accepts his metaphilosophy, and I can see that that is a big ask, and lots of people will not want to accept it, but if one were to accept to his metaphilosophy, then there is a sense in which that metaphysical challenge it simply doesn't get going, because if the notion of truth and falsity cannot be appropriately predicated to absolute presuppositions, then the metaphysical challenge cannot get going. Okay, but suppose that, for the sake of argument, you agreed with me that the metaphysical challenge cannot get going if you accept Collingwood's metaphilosophy. Yeah? You might say, well, but perhaps, you know, the epistemic challenge really is quite serious. And so what I want to do now is to try a little bit and think about how is it that Collingwood might react to the epistemic challenge. He did say something about it, and what he said about it is that, you know, the historian is like a detective, that he comes up with some kind of compelling conclusion. And that is a kind of familiar theme, I think, in the sort of late British idealists, because, for example, Oakeshott speaks of the historians as putting together stones in a dry stone walls, and, you know, those stones can only, you can't fit them in any odd way. So there is a sense in which you are constrained, the historian is constrained in the way in which they arrange the evidence. But what might he say to the epistemic challenge? Now, to be sure, the epistemic challenge is a challenge not about truth, it's a challenge about whether there is a sufficient justification for the claim that that historians put forward. And as I said, the post-narrative answer to that has been that there are criteria available, such as scope, comprehensive coherence, ability to eliminate the data, exemplification, I think Collingwood would be sympathetic, but what else could he say? So this is speculation to some extent. But what kind of thing could he say? Well, this is the sort of thing that I think if you take his approach, you might be able to say. What he might say that one must be careful to distinguish real from apparent disagreements amongst historians. And also that the fact that sometimes historians select different data for different purposes does not mean that selection is arbitrary or biased. I think that generally the gist of his response, I'll say more about this, but I think that generally the gist of his response would be that there's been a kind of, the epistemic worries facing history have probably been slightly exaggerated because of a sort of oversensitivity to the skeptical challenge. So what I want to think is about some of the objections that you hear about the possibility of historical knowledge, and then see what is it that he might say. Well, here's one. Well, look, there is no definitive account of the past because the present is constantly shifting, and and because the present is constantly shifting, it means that the accounts of the past that are given from the perspective of the present will constantly change. Now, what Collingwood would definitely deny is that we cannot, from the perspective of different presents, give the same historical account of how agents understood themselves. So he would say that in the 23rd century and in the 20th century, two historians could understand the Greeks in the same way. I mean, banning sort of incredible new discoveries stuff that one didn't know before. That he would. But on the other hand, I don't think that there is anything in Collingwood which would lead him to deny that history does, in some sense, need to be rewritten from the perspective of different presents. So, for example, the history of the emancipation of women might take a turn for the worse, and what looked like a narrative of progress towards personal and political freedom at the end of the 20th century might no longer do so at a different point in time. And so that history might look very different in 100 years' time. But I don't think that Collingwood would deny that is the case. But I think that what he might point out is that this is not a failure of historical accounts of the past to achieve objectivity in the absence of truth makers. It is rather the inevitable result of the openness of the future. So the indeterminacy here is not epistemological, It doesn't have to do with historians' inability to be objective. It's got to do with that, well, you can't control the future, it's open. So if you accept that there is indeterminacy, then clearly those accounts will need to be rewritten. So one must take care, to put blame at the appropriate door. I mean, another thing that is often said is that there are a lot of disagreements in history. And here I feel a little bit guilty because probably I am one of those philosophers who doesn't really know more about history. And I shall take, Jonathan Gorman advice to read more history. But I wonder whether perhaps, what is it that somebody with sort of Collingwood's outlook might say to this? I think that he might wonder whether some of these disagreements are, whether not all these disagreements are bad ones. So I think that somebody who says that the cause of the First World War was the assassination of the Archduke Ferdinand, and somebody who says that it was German militarism and expansionism, that's not a disagreement. Yeah? They're looking for different kind of causes, triggering and perhaps teleological causes. Here is an example. What was the cause of the fire in the Grenfell Tower? Was it a short circuit? Was it the fact that panels the panels which the external panels were not inflammable and didn't stop the fire, or was it the council that was trying to save money? Now, I don't see why all these things cannot be, in some sense, all true. It depends what you are trying to explain. So I suppose that, perhaps somebody like Collingwood who wants to disambiguate, the different senses of causes or explanations that are at work in different contexts in pride. You may say, well, look, you can look at a phenomenon from slightly different ways, and there isn't really a disagreement. Now, I don't want to suggest for a moment that once you weed out the disagreement that are just apparent, there aren't any real disagreement left. So, for example, the claim that JFK was the victim of a lone killer and that he was the victim of a political conspiracy, those are competing historical claims. But on the other hand, if you isolate, if you look at it and you think that some of these agreements perhaps are not real, then maybe the real disagreements are not as rife. And if they're not as rife, then perhaps there is less reason to be doubtful about the ability of the historical method to generate objective conclusions. Another objection is that sometimes historians, I'll come to close soon, how much I can't see the clock from here, is that historians sometimes choose according to their own personal taste or bias, so that the data they select for inclusion reflects the personal bias of the historian. But the fact that certain historians select data for inclusion or exclusion in the narrative, that select different data for inclusion or exclusion in the narrative, does not entail that selection is arbitrary, because one would not expect, say, a history of change in dress codes to have the same focus as a history of slavery. So there is a sense in which difference in selection can be harmless if it is justified by different purposes. So the claim that selection is relative to historians generates a form of historical subjectivism, analogous to the sort of objectionable ethical position which goes under the name of ethical subjectivism, which claims that what is right is relative to what a person believes to be right. But the claim that selection is made for some purpose does not mean that selection is relative to the historian who makes the selection, and does not therefore entail a form of historical subjectivism along the lines of moral subjectivism. So one should take care not to infer from the fact that selection is made for some purpose, which it has to be, or rather, by the historian, that selection necessarily reflects the bias of the historian who makes it. This inference, for me, seems to be unwarranted. So while historians may indeed have their own personal biases, these biases can be exposed if they neglect to consider data whose inclusion is necessitated by the professed goal of the narrative. So if a historian is writing about the history of the Urkel table, then he should be speaking about the Urkel table and not about the Porsche or the Jaguar. So if selection is relative to the person, the historian, rather than to the phenomenon that the historian is trying to explain, the rise of the working class, the emancipation of women, the Urkel table, then this would inevitably lead to arbitrariness. But selection in accordance with the stated goal of the narrative is not arbitrary, and does not entail a form of relativism. Now, if this is true, then perhaps a kind of radical skepticism about the ability of the historical method to generate objective conclusions is unjustified. Now, again, this is not to say that once the distinction between the historian's interest and the goals of the narrative is made, and disagreements which are only apparent are weeded out, one will find that there are no genuine disagreements. But if personal bias is not as problematic as it is assumed to be, and if historical disagreements are not as endemic as it is assumed to be, I don't know, I'd be interested to see what you think, then their existence will not be undermining of the very idea of a historical method, no more than the existence of competing scientific hypotheses is not normally taken to be undermining scientific method. So I think that the way in which Collingwood would react to this probably would be to try and diffuse that skepticism. And while suggesting that Collingwood would respond to this, to the epistemic objection to the possibility of objective historical knowledge by diffusing it and showing that real disagreements are less widespread than they are assumed to be, does involve a certain amount of speculation about what he might have said. This suggestion is compatible with the fact that the fundamental impetus behind this philosophy is not to answer skepticism about the possibility of knowledge, historical or otherwise, but to uncover its presuppositions. So, insofar as Collingwood understands philosophy as the study of absolute presuppositions, he sees philosophy as finding the hinges on which our knowledge rests, and to oil them when our worldview gets stuck in a particular direction. So he thought that our worldview is stuck on the scientific worldview, and what he wants to do is say, well, look, there are different ways of knowing, yeah? And what we have to become aware of is that these different ways of knowing are equally valid, and they provide answers to different questions. So in that sense, for him, the role of a philosophy of history is not to justify the possibility of historical knowledge. In some sense, that's something with which he begins, not with which he ends, but rather to define the sui generis nature of historical explanation against the encroachment of natural science by making explicit the presuppositions that govern these different explanatory forms. Okay, and with that, I've finished.
Thank you very much. And now we can have some questions. Oh, there are. Let's take Frankfurt.
Giuseppina, very much thanks for your interesting and very clear and theory lecture, from which I learned a lot. I'd like to ask you a question, actually in connection to what I was talking about just this morning. And then, as you will recall, I addressed the issue, what is historical knowledge and how is it expressed? Now, you actually emphasized at several occasions in your talk, focus mainly, and that has to do, of course, with the main interest of Collingwood on the explanations of human agents. But, well, we have history books like Bordeaux's book on the Mediterranean, books like John Israel on Enlightenment, books like Burkhardt on the Culture de Renaissance in Italy. And then I wonder, in the first place, could one say, is this an expression of historical knowledge as a book, as the book? So that it, let me be more precise and say, well, it is an expression of knowledge, but of a whole lot of knowledges. Or would you say, no, this is one expression of knowledge of, well, what was up to in the 16th century world in Europe as studied by Bordeaux, or in the Radical Enlightenment as studied by John Israel, or in the Enlightenment as studied by Burkhardt. If so, if you would say there is an autonomous and self-justified kind of historical knowledge that finds its articulation in these huge books of sometimes thousands of pages. Then my question would be, how would Collingwood deal with this in terms of in terms of his argument, in terms of his analysis? Would he succeed in making sense of what is existing, of what people like Model or Jonathan Israel or Burkhardt wanted to do in their book? That's my question.
All right, I hope I've understood it. In some way, I know that at the moment there is a question about what one should call, whether one should call what one is doing here the philosophy of history or the philosophy of historiography. I think that there is a sense in which what Collingwood is doing is philosophy of history in the sense in which philosophy of science is used, as opposed to philosophy. I mean, I don't want to put it that way because obviously now those two words are used interchangeably. So he's not studying, I suppose, historical texts, but he is studying, I suppose, he sees what he's doing as a second-order inquiry into the methodology.
It's not knowledge. I mean, these three books that I've mentioned present as knowledge. These are not mere texts. Orwell tells us knowledge about 15th century Europe. It has a knowledge, it has a cognitive pretence. And in that sense, it's science in the way that history, as you so wonderfully explained, can be science. I think we should agree on that.
We should do.
Agree on that. I mean, you have history books, well, dealing, for example, with who murdered Gavrilo Princip, Franz Ferdinand, and why. That doesn't go very far from what goes on in Collingwood. But on the other extreme in historical writing, you have the three kind of books that I mentioned, which are also science. Probably most historians would say there is more historical science than speaking about the murder by Gavrilo Princip of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And that gets me to my question: how can we get from Collingwood from these simple questions to these monuments, these two monuments of historical writing, expressing historical knowledge in its most impressive form?
So is your question that he is not doing enough substantive philosophy of history in a sense? No. I may have to think about that because I just don't have a ready-made answer to that question. But maybe you're going to have to ask me again, and I will think about it, as indeed I thought about Nego.
Hey, Deus.
Thank you. I enjoyed the paper very much. But
Please speak loud.
sorry. I understood to the point where there was discussion about this, that these are just different presuppositions. That science supposes that nature is uniform, and that instance that human nature or human living or whatever changes. And I understand that these are to a certain point, but when you discussed about this, that there are no truth makers for historical claims, and in some sense there are no truth makers for scientific claims either. I'm wondering that there is a tension in these presuppositions that they after this move they don't seem just to be like pragmatical presuppositions to how to just live on with our lives and how to use scientific knowledge, how to extend the scope of scientific knowledge, but it starts to seem to me like some kind of idealistic move, that we just assume that there is a uniform nature, but in fact there is no nature in itself. And I don't think that, not many scientists, I think, would accept that, neither would many philosophers of science, that the uniformity of nature is just a presupposition in this sense. It's more, it seems like, of course, it's something that cannot be proved, but we just, it's still about the world,
yeah.
not about how we can think of the world or something.
Yeah. I know, I mean, most people are constructing metaphysicians. I mean, I suppose one question is that there is the self-understanding of the scientist, and then there is the philosopher, say. Now, it is possible for science, Collingwood is not saying that at the first order level that the scientist, scientists, as far as they're concerned, they can ask these second order questions about what are their presuppositions, but when they do so, then in a sense they put on their philosophical hat. But that's precisely what he wants to say. If you think that these presuppositions have to be true in a metaphysical sense, because he accepts clearly that there are facts, in the sense there are historical facts, there are scientific facts. If they're internal to the form of inquiry, you can speak about truth and falsity, there's no problem with that. But he thinks that the conflict between science and history arises if you think that there are those that it makes sense for us to say that those presuppositions are true or false. And he denies that it makes any sense to say of them, because they are the condition of the possibility for their being true or false. So you cannot ask of them whether they are true or false. So they do their work insofar as he puts it like this. They do their work insofar as they are presupposed, not insofar as they are propounded. Because as soon as you propound them, they become propositions with a truth value. But that is precisely what he's denying. So it's that sort of, is that assumption, that the true and falsity applies to those presuppositions that generates the conflict between science and history. So if you want to find a way of making those two forms of inquiry coexisting, you have to go for, is metaphysics of absolute presupposition, is metaphysics without ontology. So that's the move he's making. So I think you've understood. You disagree, along as with many other people. Yeah.
I think this is not in. I just want to make sure, but I think this plays into this gives the upper hand to the historical study as a form of knowing that if we need to say that historians need some presuppositions about the past and how human living conditions have changed and thinking have changed. And then we say that, but it's not different from science because science has these presuppositions. It would be, I think it would be so.
Well, they're very different.
It's controversial with that, because I think
clearly he is going against the grain. Yeah, the standard model is that you've got physics, the other explanations supervene, and the explanations at the upper level, so to speak, they're okay for pragmatic purposes, but ontologically speaking, they do no causal work. Yeah, because if you let them do causal work, then you get the problem of causal overdetermination. So it's that model that he is rejecting. And once you reject that there is a level of explanations which is ontologically basic, then you have to give some other criteria on the basis of which you make the choice between one explanation and another. And his view is that really we are asking different kind of why questions. And those questions need to be disambiguated. We use the same words, but we mean different things. So in the hand of I don't even want to say the historian, because I think in some sense history as an academic discipline, as opposed to as a form of inquiry, which is how it's much more of a mixed discipline in the sense that historians use all sorts of nomological and causal explanations. Sometimes, but the point that he's making is not that historians cannot use them, but that we've got to be aware that they are different. That one thing is to explain something nomologically, and another thing is to explain them by appealing to norms. But you have understood, it's just that you don't agree with his metaphysics. And lots of people, most people are constructive metaphysicians. They want to say, how is it that non-reductivism is defended in this day? By appealing to the relationship of supervenience. This is a very, very different model to defend the form of non-reductivism.
Okay.
Thank you. It was very clarifying indeed. Could I ask about 2 points? The first is about presuppositions. Namely, if I do understand correctly, these presuppositions of various forms of inquiry are absolute, in the sense that they are universal and they do not change in time. And if this is the case, then of course it's a bit counterintuitive, because if you look into the history of science, history of historical inquiry, you see that those presuppositions tend to change. At least this is my sort of clarify this.
Okay.
The second is about the past agents that are suitable for historical.
Can I take that question? Because I just have a very short memory span. Okay. Presuppositions for Collingwood do a logical role. So they give rise to questions to which we provide answers. So they are defined by their logical role in what he calls the logic of question and answer, not by where they are in time. Clearly, there will be people who make those presuppositions. There are scientists, there are historians, there are chemists, there are biologists. But that's not what defines a presupposition. So, in a way, who makes it, when they make it, it's not what's relevant for him. For him, what's relevant is it logically efficacious? What questions does it give rise? Yeah. Do you see what I mean? So that's why is a pluralist and not a relativist. So in that sense, considerations of time. Obviously, there will be these presuppositions. There are people who make this presupposition at certain times and places, but the task of metaphysics is not to find out. Presuppositions are not causal conditions of knowledge in the way in which water is a causal condition for the existence of life. They're not causal conditions, they are logical conditions for the possibility of certain forms of inquiry. Clearly, there will have to be people, who make them, but that's not what makes them into presuppositions. What makes them into propositions is that they necessarily have to make them. So if you want to make an inductive claim, you've got to help yourself to the principle of the uniformity of nature. Yeah.
And then it's another small question about the past agents.
Can I actually continue on that? Because I had a slide on the a priori, which I then took away because I thought that it was like going a bit too far. But so in some ways, so they are not absolute. They're not absolute in a Kantian sense, because you shift, if you do one form of inquiry, you have a set of presupposition. So that presupposition is not absolutely universal in the Kantian sense. They are a priori in the sense that they are constitutive of the practice which they underpin. That's a different sense of a prioricity, which doesn't have to do with universality. It's,
That makes more sense.
Yeah.
But that's another question that is personally important. Namely, let's put it this way. According to Collingwood, can there be any non-human past agent suitable for historical inquiry?
Absolutely. What makes the past historically is the way you investigate it. So if there was a Martian that landed on Earth 20,000, 1 million years ago, fine. If we can understand them as responding to norms, fine. We can understand chimpanzees like that. I mean, there is a question about who is responding to norm and who is not. And some people think that people will put that line at different places, And then there is the question about is it different to explain something as responding to norm or explaining it empirically? And this is this latter question that he is addressing. So you could, of course, what he wouldn't allow is that, say, a historian, if a historian provided a teleological explanation, so if one provided, say, a teleological explanation of the origin of the universe, one would not be providing a history, one would be giving a creation myth. So, there is a sense in which, as much as scientists should not encroach onto the domain of inquiry of historians really should not encroach, yeah? You don't explain the Big Bang theologically, otherwise you're writing a kind of mythology of the kind that you find in the Iliad. Have I...
Oh, really, it's a long discussion board. Let's move forward.
One thing that I'd like to develop, if I may, so I'm interested in this characterization of science and history. And I find the characterization that you presented obviously commonsensical. But to what extent is this distinction between science and history substantive, and to what extent is it rhetorical? And by this I mean to ask, to what extent are the claims that scientists make over historians, these things that we hear again and again, science is objective, science is constant, science is eternal. To what extent do you think that these are rhetorical means of asserting the discipline itself, but are ultimately substantively suspect? That is to say, we know that these things, that scientific theories change. We know that the so-called objective ideas change in the same way that historical material is subject to change from vantage point, whether it's medicine, whether it's astronomy, and so on. So yeah, just to think about the rhetorical aspect of this. I mean, if we see this actually as a substantive difference between two disciplines, or whether this is ultimately a kind of rhetorical, self-justifying, self-validating positioning or something.
I don't know, maybe this is a debate between philosophers in a way, but I don't think it's purely rhetorical. I mean, I don't know, I'm not a historian, but probably, I think some, historians might be a little bit upset when they are told that they can't, ever agree with each other. And, or philosophers, are just getting bashed by people like Brian Cox, by, Stephen Hawking's. I mean, so I think that there is not all scientists are like that. I mean, some scientists sometimes come in defense of the humanities, but there are scientists who are also, well, not just scientists, who also endorse scientism. So I don't think the debate is just rhetorical. Perhaps, but it is perhaps a philosophical debate about, philosophers who stand on different sides of the fence.
Okay.
Thank you. So, first a note, I completely agree with your account that Collingwood can account for some minimal or some certain level of disagreement between historians. I think that this is really why there is some disagreement between historians, which is admissible, but also to recognize the admissible level of disagreement between historians, I think we need some theory of consensus between historians, as Tucker proposed. So I think we cannot go without it. Although I would not like to base historical knowledge on consensus, I think this is something we cannot fully avoid with Collingwood. And second thing, I was interested in the dynamic of absolute presuppositions. Actually, when I'm doing reenactment and I'm trying to uncover presuppositions of historical agents, do I also keep my own scientific presuppositions? Because I think I cannot go without them when I'm trying to reenact something. For example, for Collingwood, many historical disciplines were proper histories. So for example, even, I don't know, from history of fashion would be a history of what? History of fashion or clothing, for example. And when I'm looking at some evidence, at some piece of clothing worn by people in Roman Britain, I still believe that those people had one head, two legs, two hands. And this is not presupposition I found in that clothing. This presupposition I would call scientific presupposition.
I'm not sure I've actually heard the question properly.
Okay. Or is it, when I'm doing historical reenactment, and when I'm reenacting some false or historical agents, do I keep my own scientific presuppositions in play?
Well, I mean, there will be some. There are maybe some archaeological facts that you know, and say, I mean, not all archaeology is scientific archaeology, but there are maybe some scientific facts that are handed over to you, and you will use those. But on the other hand, I think that these explanations, often crisscross each other. So it's not as if, we've got historians here and scientists here, and historians never use nomological explanations, and scientists never use any other kinds of explanation. That's not the point that Collingwood is making. The point is that there are these different forms of inferences. And in a kind of pure form, he calls one history, and in a pure form, he calls the other science. But the reality is messy. They keep on crisscrossing, and the job is to be aware of the fact. So,
I think that was the answer to my question.
Right. Okay. Good.
Okay. Joni, I think, and then there and there. So.
Okay. Thank you very much for your talk, and it gave me a lot to think, and I'm of course very happy to be compared to Collingwood in any way, even if you would have antedated some of what I then suggested. And I'd like to make a comment, a question, another question, maybe another question. Let's see, but I'll do it briefly. And the first has to do with what I call narrativist insight, and perhaps Frank was referring to something like that. Historians produce by their books some kind of complete synthesized views, larger views, and those have features that cannot reflect the past, that they cannot be true because of that, so they have meanings, or some call them narratives, I've called them theses, or some kind of integrated units of historical knowledge anyway. The examples I have used is sleepwalking thesis. Mm-hmm. So I can't see how that could be true of the past, that the European great powers went to the First World War like sleepwalkers. Still, it might be a good claim, good suggestion. It might be somehow justifiable. Or Eric Hobsbawm's claim that the 20th century was short. So it's just a different kind of cognitive play on that higher form of historiographical knowledge. That brings me to the first question. You showed a slide about history of women's progress. It was earlier one of the slides. And then you said that Collingwood's answer would be something like that it's retrospectively we are looking at the past and then shifting the views, and because historians always would like to narrate or write it again. But then doesn't that suggest that actually there is a subjective element, is subject dependent? Every kind of historical account is subject dependent. So it can't be of the object entirely, and therefore it cannot be true. There is no possibility to get to the truth in the past in this sense.
Well, I don't know, it's what we were speaking about yesterday over dinner. It's like President Trump's tweeting. Okay, so how will it be viewed? Well, it depends on how things go, doesn't it? I mean, hopefully, in 100-year times, it'll be described as the annoying habit of the 45th President of the United States. But it could potentially be described as a trigger of a world war. But is that the historian's fault? It doesn't seem to me that that's the historian's fault. It's because, I mean, unless one is assuming that, I mean, I suppose I am not assuming a view of time which says that things exist at all time, and that, the historian is just happened to be at a particular time, like Doctor Who in his time machine. Yeah? So
But I don't see it as a problem. I'm one of those who doesn't see it as a problem.
Right.
I just don't think there's a fact of the matter on the larger scale. What is the significance of that, for example? That's why I try to find some other criteria too, that it's not that we can just anything, but some other kind of epistemic criteria. I think that's just fine. But I don't think how then, why would Collingwood, if you are right about history of women's progress and that it could be rewritten, how there could be a fact of the matter, or how would it be true fact of the matter of that very process they are describing. I think there isn't. It has to be about some other way. But should I make another comment?
I'm not sure.
Matter?
I'm not sure whether I'm the. So is it was the point that there is a kind of subjectivity involved because we are changing point in time?
And we probably would need to analyze in what way and what kind of subjectivity it is. But yes, something comes from the subject side and not entirely of the object side when we are providing an account or description of the house.
Right. I suppose if the goal was to write a history of women, I can see why that goal might generate a different narrative from different points in time, and the historians who write at different points in time are not being subjective just because they're writing different narrative. It's just that the events have changed. As in the case of President Trump tweeting, yeah?
Right.
If things turn out for the better, then okay.
But if in their final account there is something about the point of view they described, then I think subjectivity goes into the account itself.
Okay, if they sided with Trump, or okay.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think yes, that is true.
Would like to talk about data, but I don't have time, I guess.
I think that if you take two questions still, so Tony.
Thank you. I would like to come back to the question of presuppositions. You mentioned they have to do with the types of questions we are asking, and then later, now answering Marek, you said that the logical forms the possibility of knowledge, and it's all agreed. Now, the notorious nature of any presuppositions is that they come hidden, right? I almost never consciously choose them, whereas in your account it seems that I should somehow be knowledgeable of them as I go, as I choose my questions and go into that. Whereas normally what my presuppositions are would be the very last phase of my knowledge after I have done already all the work. How do we? And then you call some of the presuppositions absolute, I think. Now, how do you deal with this nature of presuppositions being hidden and our need of, according to your account at least, knowing them first?
I think that what Collingwood says is that what philosophy does is never teaches us something completely new, but something that we always already implicitly knew. So in some sense, the presuppositions are operative, and what philosophy does is bring them to the fore or bring them to light by showing what it is that you have to commit yourself in order to make certain claims. Clearly, the more fundamental they are, the harder they are to get at. But I also think that in his case, and I think that's probably why I like his metaphilosophy, and it's not something that he says explicitly, but it's that he doesn't think that philosophy can only do this retrospectively, so that it's always too late, when philosophy comes on the scene. It has a positive role, really, and in that respect, that's why he doesn't have, for example, a purely therapeutic conception of the role. Because a lot of the things that I've said here, you could see how you could map them, but it doesn't have that sort of therapeutic streak, or even the thought that philosophy arrives only too late. Actually, it's a powerful tool to make us think deeper about the presuppositions to which we are committed. Absolute, what he means by absolute is not absolute in the Kantian sense. So they are constitutive. So they're not universal in that sense. But
one side question then, why, I think that scientists are often justified in saying that in objecting that, well, talk about presuppositions is a hindrance to their work. I mean, it doesn't add to the productivity of science in no way. So that's why they seem to be not willing to have a dialogue with philosophy, also the current.
That's right, but in a way, that's right, they don't need to be aware of their presuppositions in order to do their job. They don't need to, okay? But on the other hand, what Collingwood would say is that unself-consciousness or unawareness of your presuppositions leads to dogmatism. That's what scientism is. It's a form of dogmatism. It's the view that your presuppositions are the only, reflect, are metaphysically true. So I think that's ultimately what scientism is a form of dogmatism about presuppositions.
Okay.
You mentioned about famous metaphor, historian as a detective. And my question is, what are the presuppositions of this metaphor? Because I think that this figure of a detective is interpreted in a very individualistic way, like Sherlock Holmes. But detective doesn't work in social vacuum, social void, where is a prosecutor, judge, law, legal system. And what about it? I think that it is possible to propose a different interpretation of being detective, historian as a detective, not individualistic, but as a historian or detective is a part of social system.
It is a bit of a loose analogy in some sense. I think that, the point I think that he wants to make and that wants to extract from it, it's that historians are constrained in the way in which detectives are constrained. And that when they come up with something that looks watertight, then, and you are presented with it, you accept it because you think that, it's a bloody good way of presenting the evidence. But I can see that it's not it is a loose analogy. On the other hand, it does make that important point that, maybe, one can only ask for, as much objectivity as the subject matter allows at the end of the day, and that's the case in history, but that's not a denigratory statement. Okay, I'm off the hook.
Thank you.